listening to Ding Dong Darkness Time Season 2, Stephen King Boogaloo. I gathered several of my most well-read friends together to discuss many of our favorite works by the master of the macabre himself. If you like what you hear, tell the world. In the meantime, let's talk some scary stories. Oh, and beware the spoilers, folks. They're a doozy. Hello, everybody. It's Allison Dixon here, along with my buddy Chris Armstrong. As promised in the season finale where we discussed Maximum Overdrive, we're coming back bearing a couple of bonus goodies. This is a discussion on two of our favorite short stories from Stephen King's stellar 2002 short story collection, Everything's Eventual. The collection features 11 short stories and 3 novellas, and frankly, there isn't a single entry in it that isn't worth reading. In fact, I think I've read each of the stories in this book at least 3 times, as well as listened to the audio version, so I'm ready to roll with this. I would talk about this entire collection in depth if we had the time, but as I said, this is a mini episode, so we won't be doing that. If you want to hear collection picked apart in full depth, go listen to the Night Shift episode I did with Terry Lynn Coop. But in this case, Chris and I decided to each feature our favorite story from this collection. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chris because we just want to get this show right on the road, man.
That's right. And I'm really excited about this story. It's one I've talked about a lot and have wanted to explore a bit. And it's called Man in the Black Suit. And I came to this story, I think I mentioned on this podcast before, and on 80s High, my other podcast, that I took a fiction writing course in college. As an elective, I was just like, I want to take a class. And our textbook for the class was On Writing by Stephen King. And coincidentally, there are 2 connections I have to this story, as well as the one that Allison is going to talk about, 1408, which is so great. So we'll talk about this connection here in that. So On Writing is our textbook, and we get assigned Man in the Black Suit as one of the stories that we go through. And I loved the professor I had for that. He was like this guy in his late 30s, early 40s, beard, glasses, just very enthusiastic about teaching. And he was so excited for us to read this story. And it just grabbed me in a very just visceral way that I mentioned on the episode where we talked about the Trucks short story. This is another one where you had this very compact, contained story that just feels real, this world. And it has the benefit of being set in the early 1900s. So it has this mystical kind of quality to it where times were simpler and it wasn't the hustle and bustle. You're in the country and it's just a simple story of this kid just wants to finish his chores and go fishing, hopefully get a couple fish at a castle stream. That's it. That's the premise. That's all he wants to do. But oh my goodness, does the story go sideways?
Yeah, it truly does. I love how this story so beautifully blends the literary fiction side of King's sensibilities with his genre fiction side. To the tune, I think people in the literary community have largely shunned Stephen King as kind of a genre hack. And in fact, he kind of sells that image of himself openly everywhere that he goes. But not many genre hacks win the O. Henry Award or the National Book Award. And genre hacks don't typically get their stories published in The New Yorker, which is where this story appeared originally in 1994.
And what's so funny is he saw this as a throwaway story. He didn't think it was all that great. And here it gets all of these accolades, which is just funny that it's another way to show writers don't always know their strengths and the value of some of the works they put out there.
Right. I am often, and I think we're all often struck similarly by this, perhaps on social media, for instance. We put a lot of effort into, say, writing a post on something that means something to us. And, you know, it gets like 4 or 5 likes and hardly anyone comments on it. But then you just have some kind of throwaway, silly thought. And then it kind of goes mini viral. And you're just like, what the hell? This was a nothing thought. This happens to me frequently on Twitter.
I was going to say, or you blog about the Alpha Smart Neo.
Yes. I had a blog for a very, very long time that I don't really have anymore. In fact, it doesn't even exist anymore. But I did 2 entries out of hundreds and hundreds of blog entries that I spent a lot of time on. I did, yes, a review of a writing device called the Alpha Smart Neo. And I also did one that was a Peruvian chicken recipe.
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, it was really good because there's a place here in Dayton, Ohio that we go to called Nellie's Chicken, and they just make the most amazing rotisserie chicken. And they have the whole method of doing it. And so I researched it, found out largely how it's done, posted it on the internet. Those are my two biggest blog posts. Nothing that I ever wrote about the craft of writing or life experiences or any other thoughtful breakthroughs I ever had on that blog stacked up to those two things. So I can see in some ways how King thought this was a little throwaway for him because, yes, it feels familiar in many ways. There are a lot of King hallmarks here in terms of this, the description of the setting. He writes rural stories so beautifully. Yeah. I keep mentioning the story 1922 because I really want people to go read it if they haven't read it, or just watch the movie on Netflix because it's fantastic. Also starring Thomas Jane, who is just a regular in the King verse, but it has that rustic horror feel to it. My husband and I recently went on our road trip driving from Ohio to Las Vegas, saw a lot of just open, desolate country, and it felt very unchanged. It felt very much from that world, and there was a haunted nature to it. Yeah. So lends itself so well to that. It feels very King. But then, yes, the boy goes fishing. And what does he encounter, Chris?
Well, he encounters a man in the black suit, which he quickly realizes is the devil. And I should say that there are two very important influences for this story being made. And one of them is a Nathaniel Hawthorne story called Young Goodman Brown. Are you familiar with this story?
I am familiar with the homage to it or the reference to it, but I have not read the story.
Nor have I. So a recap if you don't know, and I did not know. It's a short story, as I said, by Nathaniel Hawthorne, published in 1835. And effectively, it's about Puritan fears of evil lurking everywhere, even in the hearts and minds of good Christian communities. And so basically, Goodman Brown, recently married to a woman named Faith, a little on the nose there, Nathaniel, but anyway, wanders into the woods one night, sees strange happenings. He starts to question his faith in the people around him, even losing faith in his wife, Faith, along with all humanity. And he becomes really embittered and suspicious and kind of cynical and wary. And the story concludes with the line, "And when he had lived long and was borne to his grave, they carved no hopeful verse upon his tombstone, for his dying hour was gloom."
Oh, wow.
Dang, Nate, you got to kick it up a notch, buddy. That's some ding-dong darkness time right there.
It really is. I will have to read that. That sounds right after my own heart and feels like a emotionally true kind of story. I think we see people like this, right?
Absolutely.
Go through life becoming more and more disillusioned. It seems a common theme, and it's interesting to see that discussed in a story from the 1830s. Is that what you said? My goodness,
almost 200 years ago.
Yeah,
Jeez.
Yeah, exactly. Jeez. This is, again, the more things change, the more
they stay.
Yeah.
And if you read the story, you definitely see a lot of parallels between this journey of young Goodman Brown and our main character, Gary, who's this 9-year-old boy. Mm-hmm. The other one is, this one gives me chills. He said that a friend of his told him that his friend's grandfather came face to face with the devil himself in the form of an ordinary man. So his grandfather, not too dissimilarly, out in the woods, encounters this random guy. And as he's talking to him, is like, this man is the devil in disguise. Now, whether that's actually true or not, and this guy just wasn't like a super creeper or whatever, the idea of that is still terrifying because this grandfather certainly believed it. And imagine you're just sitting there, and he said his grandfather did everything in his power to not react and be very normal and not let on that he knew. And even if you don't think you're going to meet the devil on the street, I think we've all been in a scenario where all of a sudden you're like, this person is dangerous and I need to not react. I need to not let anything on. I'm just going to finish this conversation and be on my way. I think we've all had an encounter like that with somebody who feels dangerous or is dangerous. And so that one it kind of gives me chills when I think about it.
And the way that he reveals this man, because young Gary, after grabbing his creel and his fishing rod and after doing his chores, and he heads over to the river, we get a little bit of establishment at that point about his mom and how she is, and how he had a brother, right, who died of a bee sting.
Yeah, he had an older brother. Again, another trope of Stephen King, dying of bee stings. Goes back to Misery, right?
Right.
Yeah, his older brother is stung to death he's allergic and is killed by these bees, and his dad has to carry him back to their farmhouse. And he's got like a shirt draped over his brother's head, and it's just this nightmare scenario where, just this small little encounter takes away a life of a child. Dan is the brother's name. And so his mother, rightfully so, is very concerned for her now living child, her only living child, Gary.
Yeah, pretty much telling him, be careful.
Yeah, she's like, don't go past the fork in the stream, right? Where are you going to go? Not any farther. And, it's this very nurturing, caring kind of sense you get of the mother. And he even has this thing where he's like, I remember it so clearly. She's standing there in the kitchen. There's a curl of her hair hanging by her face. The light is hitting it. It looks like a filament of gold. And he just has this very vivid vision of his mother, which we'll come back to. But it's just this great snapshot, flashbulb memory that he has as he's talking to his mom, and he's going to go off on this adventure.
And the thing I love about this too, this varies in a lot of ways from, say, The Body, which is, another rural kind of adventure story, but told in a later period, where all the boys in that story come from very dysfunctional and broken homes. This home feels very loving. Both of these parents love their son.
Which King doesn't always do, right?
No. In fact,
rarely.
I think that makes it a kind of a welcoming shift in the dynamic. So, he, with all that in mind, he goes off and starts catching fish, and he catches some big ones. He catches a couple good fish.
He catches a trout and a brookie, and he's got his little creel, and you can see he's kind of doing the measuring and everything. So he's like picking up what his father had taught him about catching fish, and I think he even guts some of them, and he
cleans them out.
Little guy gets tuckered out.
Yeah, he's very tired, so he lays down on the side of the brook and he falls asleep. Yeah. Takes a little nap in the sun, and then when he wakes up...
You'd think it'd be to a man standing over him.
No, it's a bee.
On his nose.
On his nose.
Which is almost more terrifying. The story has set up this tiny bee so much that you're now so afraid for this kid, because you're like, is he allergic like his brother was? And it's just this...
Right.
You kind of seize up, and he's sitting there looking at it, and he's not sure what to do. And you sit with that for a while, but then suddenly he hears a clap, and the bee drops dead.
And then he looks over and sees the man in the black suit. And the vision of this man, because immediately he's not of this world, right?
Yeah, right. Yep.
Yeah. Mostly due to the fact that his eyes are bright orange, like they're on fire.
Pale skin, claw-like fingers.
And doesn't he smell of sulfur? Doesn't he, didn't he describe that already? I can't remember if that was in the initial description.
His body smells like burnt match heads. And King uses this term a lot about the aroma baking from the suit. He uses the term baking. And so it's almost like this just rancid loaf of bread that's permeating from his body. And yeah, again... People always say the devil and demons have the smell of sulfur on them, right? And that's what Gary is smelling. And he's getting this sense from this man that he's quickly realizing is no mere man.
And I love the juxtaposition of a man in a black suit with burning eyes in this very peaceful, tranquil, little gentle river flowing through green sunshine. It's just such a stark...
You can hear it.
Contrast.
You can hear the trickle of the water, maybe a little breeze of the leaves on the wind, and you just see this man, and he refers to Gary as, hello there, Fisher Boy. He always calls him Fisher Boy.
And he has nothing good from the, really, there's a little bit of charm that he comes out with initially, but
it's very brief.
He immediately starts coming out with some really disturbing news.
Yeah, he kind of says hey, I saved you from the bee, unlike your brother who wasn't saved. And he's like, I have some bad news for you, Gary. Your mother's dead, stung by a bee. She passed a fatal flaw onto your brother. and maybe a little bit of your father's strength saved you. So he's just going into this whole just chilling story. And as you're hearing this, you're like, did this man, this creature, this devil kill his mother? And now he's going to come here and gloat to break this news to this child. And what's so interesting is he has both this like knowing, omniscient kind of presence, but also a very, not childlike, but childish approach.
Yes.
Because at one point, Gary wets himself because he's so terrified. And the creepiest thing this man in the black suit does is he bends down and smells it, the urine smell. And he's like, he does this sing-song thing. Opal, diamond, sapphire, jade, I smell Gary's lemonade.
Yeah. Ugh.
Which again,
it's just gross.
It's like the bully kid at school says that, not this devil incarnate. And to me, it adds something even more terrifying than if he was this like, I will pull you to the burning hells asunder. Nothing like that. It's just, he's like the embodiment of a child bully and this creepy man, not man. It reminds me of, do you remember in Men in Black when the bug is in the Edgar suit? Like in the...
Yes. Big time.
It's not in the same comical way, but it's almost like this demon trying to be a human and failing miserably.
That's hilarious. That's the second reference this show has had, by the way, in the Hearts in Atlantis episode. I compared the low men in yellow coats. The low men, I compared them to the Edgar suit from Men in Black.
That one hasn't released yet, so I haven't gotten to hear that. That's hilarious. Yeah. Oh, I look forward to that.
Yeah. I love that reference, and I love anytime we get to see it, because that's such a good evocative comparison.
Yeah.
And we really see that come to life when, well, first of all, Gary doesn't really believe him, doesn't want to believe him. Yeah. He's very much has faith in his parents and immediately senses the evil in him,
But the man knows things that a stranger shouldn't know. And I think that's where the doubt starts to creep in. He doesn't want to believe it, but this man, this guy, knows a whole lot.
And again, this is such a theme that King plays with so much, about that turning point in a child's life between innocent and not so innocent, that losing of that childhood set of blinders, right? Where everything's good and safe and whatever. And then there's always that thing that happens, that encounter, that tragedy, whatever. And this right here for Gary is that moment where he is about to shed the last of that innocent childhood. And yes, caused by forcing you to doubt everything you've ever believed about your family, and the world itself. You're encountering the devil. And then the imagery gets even more surreal.
It does. I do want to say, though, he's taunting him in a way that reminds me a lot of Pennywise taunting the children.
Yes. Oh, I thought of Pennywise as well.
Right?
That's
like
a very good point.
Menacing, tormenting kind of thing where, Pennywise does it because it salts the children's fears. And in this one, you just get a sense that this demon is getting his kicks out of making this child just twist his stomach left and right. I wrote this down. He said, "She made the most wonderfully awful noise. She wept as she died. Isn't that sweet?" Like just this terrible language.
Didn't he say something about the dog coming along and licking the tears off her face or something?
I forget, but he may have. It's
the dog and and the dog's
Candy
name,
Bill?
Candy Bill.
Another freaking Bill. No more bills, Steve. No more bills.
Stephen King and all his bills.
Yeah,
am I right?
Them bills, though.
Oh yeah.
Oh man.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, you're right. So this is where it starts to turn a little bit surreal, where the Edgar suit starts to melt, if you will.
A little bit.
So what happens?
A little bit. So Gary wants to get away. And I think doesn't he offer his big fish over?
Well, let me tell you how he puts this, because this is just the most terrifying thing. I'm starving, because he changes the subject. I'm going to kill you and tear you open and eat your guts, Fisher Boy.
That's right.
So he's taunting him about his mother, and all of a sudden he's like, he just turns this corner. And at that point, yeah, you're right. Gary grabs one of the fish and kind of throws it at him, and he does this like, big fish. And he talks about how his voice goes into this like inhuman register that's
Right.
really deep as he sees this. And what happens next?
He shoves it whole down his entire gullet, and his neck expands. He's almost like a snake eating like a big rabbit or something like that.
His jaw is unhinged. Like his mouth just sort of falls open. And this is the part where he talks about his gullet blazed red like his eyes, the heat pouring from him like a fireplace, and he begins to cry bloody tears.
Blood. Yes.
Ugh.
Yeah. There is something so horrifyingly unreal. It's like something you would see out of one of your own nightmares.
100%.
Full nightmare territory here. And it's at this point, I think, does Gary starts to see.
At this point, Gary runs away. Like, he sees his opportunity to get the hell out of there and starts running. And the man in the black suit, as he's swallowing this fish, is like, you can't get away, Fisher boy. It'll take more than a trout to fill me up. So basically, he's running up this stream embankment, and right on his heels is this guy, and his mouth is still kind of contorted, and he can still smell that awful smell. And it's just this nightmare scene of this child trying to get away from this creature. And he starts to get away and thinks he's made it some distance, and he turns around and it says that the man is right at his heels. And that just every time gets me. It's like the slasher movie from the 80s where Jason's right behind you and you think you've outrun him and outsmarted him. And finally he kind of pulls himself up on this bridge and flips himself onto it and takes off down the road and manages to outrun the devil himself.
Exactly. And then most of the way back to the house, he runs into his dad. His dad was going to come down and meet him to fish after he saw a man about some cows, essentially. And then he runs into his dad and he just starts sobbing like, Mom's dead. Man by the river told me. And
his dad's like, no, I was just at home. The
she's
cell happened
fine.
early, half hour ago. She's fine. And like Gary just can't believe it because of who he's run into. And he's like, I have to see Mom. And so they end up going back. And his dad starts to have some suspicions that maybe Gary's covering up for the fact that he didn't have his creel or his fishing pole.
he lost his stuff.
And he's like, did you fall asleep and maybe had a nightmare? And Gary just really can't bring himself to say, I met the frickin' devil.
Right. And there's so many doubts already must be playing in his head because, once he sees his mother, then poor kid.
As I'm reading this, I don't know if he's going to actually see his mom or not. That's the effect of this story, is this whole time I'm like, she's fucking dead. It's the devil. Of course he killed her.
They will get back together and find her dead. I think I remember having that same feeling when I first read this story.
Yeah, it's like the story leads you there. Plus, it's Stephen frickin' King. You're just like, of course she's mutilated and mangled, or her face is all like purpled and disfigured. And you get back and she's there, normal as can be. He was just tormenting this poor child, and he embraces her, and she's like, what's going on? And, finally this massive relief. I can only imagine being in that scenario and just seeing your mother, this woman that you had just had this striking vision of, and she's there. She's alive. Oh,
yeah. And in that relief is so palpable. And then the minute that his dad says, we got to walk back down there now. We're going to get your creel and your rod. And because Gary doesn't want to go anywhere near that
place. Nor does he want his dad to.
Right. And so before they go, he gets the family Bible to take with him. And his dad's like, your mother will kill you if she sees you've done this, but okay.
Hang on to that. Yeah.
Because it's interesting. This is a devout Christian family. And it's funny. Here's the opportunity to have their faith kind of almost validated in a way, but he's doubtful, like we all would be, as an adult. And it kind of shows again that juxtaposition between the childhood belief and the adult lack of it, that skepticism. But one of the most haunting elements of the story, because we were both adults when this came out. I was an adult when I read it, and I was definitely on Dad's side in that sense. And I would be, I think if my kid came to me like that, I'd be immediately thinking of the logical explanation here. So it's so chilling whenever they get down to the creek and they find it's
a yellow patch of grass. So basically there's lush green and it's this yellow patch, and the dad kind of smells it. And Gary's still up on the bridge and he's like, I bet he smells that burnt match smell. And he collects the creel and he's coming back up and he finds the fishing pole and sees another yellow patch. And that's where he's like, oh, you caught a second fish, because Gary kind of fibbed a bit and said he caught one. And he's like, yeah. And the dad comes back up and you can tell he's kind of looking at all this stuff. And finally, he just throws the creel into the creek and is like, it just didn't smell right.
Yeah.
And it's never stated, but you just get a sense that the dad understood in that moment something awful happened. And he's like, let's get out of here.
Not being in his head, you can only imagine both what he experienced and what it might have called to in his own memory, and what made him kind of come around to believing Gary in his own way. And it kind of goes on from there, just in the sense that, because Gary is an old man narrating this story, he's writing this down. I believe he's in a nursing home. He, kind of went on and had a family and all this, but he's alone now and very, very haunted, knowing that he's nearing the end of his life. And, he's so worried about encountering the man in the black suit again.
Yeah, he has this great line where he's like, he realizes he's done nothing wrong to fear the devil, but yet he came. It's this whole idea. It's like, I haven't done anything really wrong. I lived this good life. And, I think there's even a mention that he got his mother to go back to church at some point. And so you get a sense that he lived this great Christian life. He's like, I've done nothing to fear the devil, but he showed up, and who's to say he won't come again? And it's just this really just goosebump kind of chilling feel that we end on. And such a great little story. Oh my God.
It is a pinnacle of like this quiet horror, because the realness involved in, you can spend your life doing good and devout things and following your faith and all this, and still there's no guarantee. Yeah. And that is a chilling thought to be left with. And he did it beautifully. I think King, again, wove his own spirituality into this story in such a real way that really makes you want to discuss and ponder a lot of those things. So it is worthy of all the accolades that it received. And sorry, Steve, it's a great story.
Get over it,
it's
Steve.
One of your best.
Come on, man.
Accept our accolades. In this collection, by the way, is so, as I said in the beginning, it is full of so many great stories.
Do you have any honorable mentions that people should, if they had to check out, should check out?
Absolutely. Yeah. But before we dive into 1408, because we got a little more to discuss on that one, I would say All You Love Will Be Carried Away is this very powerful story about suicide, to be frank, and disillusionment and all that. And if you're a fan of The Dark Tower, that's a novella in the middle of this. The Little Sisters of Eluria gives you a great little side quest for Roland, the hero of the Dark Tower series. Lunch in the Gotham Cafe is a stunningly weird story about a husband and wife. They're going through a divorce, and they and their lawyers are meeting in this cafe for lunch. There's a character in that's kind of reminiscent of the man in the black suit.
Oh, interesting.
In fact. It gets a little over the top crazy. Very haunting story. LT's Theory of Pets is another fantastic one. Honestly, I could go on and on about this collection. Oh, The Road Virus Heads North, this haunted painting. It's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. So definitely check this out. I have read the hardcover multiple times, but it's on Audible and very well read. And King himself narrates a few of these stories, and including the one that we're about to talk about here, which is, again, 1408, which King considers the Ghost at the Haunted Inn story. Yeah. It actually, again, tied to On Writing. It was an appendix piece in On Writing as a little writing exercise that King was presenting to show how drafts evolve as you go along the storytelling process. And then he decided that he would develop it into a full story. It intrigued him, to say the least.
And that's the bit I wish I remembered from when I took that class, because this was the other connection I just learned about. And I was like, oh my goodness, I don't remember that being in there.
I do actually. Because it's the way he described the bar whenever Mike Enslin, the main character, walks into the hotel, and all the details that he describes in that hotel lobby. And so this story, once King had it written, it appeared first in audio form in a collection called Blood and Smoke. And it's a collection of 3 stories, all 3 of which are in this collection. So we have In the Death Room, Lunch at the Gotham Cafe, which I already mentioned, and this one. And it features a character named Mike Enslin who writes nonfiction books based on his experiences in multiple like famous haunted houses, haunted graveyards.
Like, what is it? 10 nights in 10 haunted houses, 10 nights in 10 haunted cemeteries. Yeah.
And, we've all seen books like this, right? For instance, like the Haunted Ohio books.
I was just going to say, there's like, I don't know how many there are now, but I remember there being like at least
so
4
many
Haunted Ohio books when we were growing up. And it was like, I know this place. Oh, that's near my hometown. Yeah, those were so much fun.
I would love to write a series like this. I think just the thought of going to spend the night in some of these places, like in the story, he talks about having slept on in Jeffrey Dahmer's old house next to H.P. Lovecraft's grave. And
hey, by the way, listen, if you want to hear about spelunking and old abandoned places, you should listen to the season 1 bonus episode on Ashmore Estates.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I honestly, we could have spent the night in there. That would have been interesting, huh?
Oh, goodness.
So Mike has this thing, though. He writes about all these things, but he doesn't believe any of it.
Yeah.
Because he has never had a paranormal experience.
It's like he's intellectually intrigued by it, but he's also skeptical that it's a thing because, like you said, he's gone to so many of these and he hasn't experienced anything. So his writing style, and you get it through his dialogue, and it works in the movie as well, which I know we'll talk about, where you just get this kind of, it's not quippy, it's sort of little witty comments, right? Like, is that how you would describe it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. He's very quick-witted.
Yes.
He has an answer for everything.
That's true. That's a good way to put it.
And he came to the Dolphin Hotel determined to get in this room 1408. Now, they were fighting him all along the way on giving him this room. Well, Mike is a, New York Times bestselling author. He, has a lawyer in his employ who quoted a civil rights law going back several decades that states that if the room's vacant and the customer wants it, you have to give it to them. And that is, in fact, an actual law. And in fact, the reason that he probably would have gotten that room, even if it was considered dangerous, is that they would have to use the reasoning that it's haunted by ghosts to deny him. And that's just not a good excuse. Like I read like a whole thing saying that, he probably would have been able to get in there based on that law.
When he's talking to Olin, who's the hotel manager, they have a very long conversation, almost a third of this story.
This is honestly probably my favorite part of the whole thing.
It's a great exchange because would you say it's 1/3 of the story?
Yes,
I
absolutely.
would say, a third of it is basically, what's it, Gerald Olin? What's his first name? Gerald Olin, yeah. So he's basically every way possible trying to convince Mike to not stay in that room. And it's interesting to your point about like the law of it is Mike actually brings it up at one point where he's like, why didn't you just make it your own residence or assign it a residence to somebody so you didn't have to rent it out even if no one stayed in it? And Olin has some good explanations as to why he couldn't do that, but he had considered it because once again, he's doing everything in his power and they're having this really great back and forth conversation. And Olin has read his books and he knows his style. And what it really comes down to is he's like, you're talking about ghosts, which were people. He's like, this is not a ghost haunting. This room is something altogether different.
Yeah, there's no spirit in this room that is of this earth. And what's interesting, too, is little bits of dread really hit you because what Mike comes in with knowing is the suicides in the room, which there were like 12, right? Over a span of 68 years, which is a lot of suicides. But then Olin brings up the natural deaths, 42 of them, in fact. Or no, it was like 42 deaths total. I think there's some differentiation between that and the movie.
It's a little fewer in the short story than what's in the movie.
Yeah.
Like the numbers are slightly off, but it's a handful, or it's a lot for sure.
So like seizures, heart attack, stroke, all these natural deaths occurring. And somebody drowned in the story. You mentioned somebody drowned in a bowl of soup.
Yeah, that's actually in the movie as well. Same thing.
And of course, it's mentioned, why is it called 1408? Because it's on the 14th floor, but only because they call it the 14th. It's actually the 13th due to the old superstition of the 13th floor. Yep. And by the way, Chris, have you ever noticed that? Have you ever noticed a 13th floor missing in a hotel elevator?
Oh, most buildings. So as listeners may know, I live in Seattle and I work downtown, and they were building this new building. And on the way they build these buildings, the elevator shafts get built first. And so this building across the street, it was just like the main central corridor for the elevator shafts. And they had numbers for the floors. And it went 12, 14.
That's
and
incredible.
12 is a big number in Seattle because 12th man, it's the whole Seahawks thing. And so the 12 was like a giant 12 for that. But then it went to 14 and I was like, wow, still. In the 2020s, we're still doing this. Okay.
I noticed that in New York when I visited. I went in several high rises there, also missing 13th floors. Oh, yeah. And I mentioned in the episode with the mist, I constantly look for rooms 1408 in buildings that I go to. It's become one of my favorite things. In fact, I found something in my fact hunting on this that due to alleged paranormal activity, the Emily Morgan Hotel in San Antonio, Texas, has sealed one of their rooms 1408.
Wow.
So I need to do some research on this room. It might have to be like a Ding Dong Ditch episode at some point if it proves juicy enough.
Oh yeah, very intriguing.
And I love how Olin has scared. He's gotten under Mike's skin a little bit as he's telling him all these things about what has happened in the room. I love too how he talks about when they go to clean the room, because the room gets a light turn, as they call it, once a month. And how they send people who are close, that get along with one another, and to do it in pairs. And they're always supervised. But then he talks about how one of the people who went in there to clean went blind. Yeah. And then like once she was down the hall away from the room a little bit, her vision came back. And there was like a set of twins that would clean the room, like 2 hotel chambermaids. And one of the sisters, she died young of like early dementia, and she had a lot of heart troubles and a lot of health issues. Yeah. And so he talks about all this, and Mike finds him, in spite of himself, becoming a little afraid.
His skepticism's still there. You can see it creep in, especially when the natural deaths come up. I think that's where you start to see a little crack in his armor. And he at least acknowledges for sure that Olin believes what he's saying. Because he's like, oh, this is typical. I've been to these places before. They tell a good story. It sells rooms and, it's a big attraction. But he's like, no, Olin really believes this. And just the way that Olin delivers the information encounters the kind of snarky comebacks that Mike has. He just has a way of almost disarming him. And then again, the natural deaths come in, and that's where you see Mike he still wants to go. He's still not going to be deterred, but you see just that little seed of doubt.
And Olin comes at it too from a place of deep respect for Mike, because he's read Mike's work. He read one of Mike's earliest works before he got into the haunted location biz. And, because Enslin tried to be a quote unquote real writer at one point. He wanted to be a poet.
I think that's only in the movie.
No, it's mentioned in the short story. Okay. Yeah, it's mentioned very briefly. Not to the same extent. The movie goes more deeply into it, but Olin, says, why are you doing this? And you don't really believe any of this. And in fact, he tells Enslin, Mike, he tells him, like, you are the worst kind of person to go into this room because you have no belief whatsoever. But it's coupled with the fact that Olin tells him that nobody's ever lasted more than an hour, really, in this room. So this is, if I were hearing this myself, knowing like I'm generally quite skeptical of this kind of stuff, but if I heard all these stories and all this stuff like dumped on me, I don't know, man. I don't know if I could go in there. I mean, I would probably just step inside, leave the door open,
and like peek in a little bit. Well, and Olin even expounds a little bit too when he's saying that his skepticism or disbelief is a liability. He also says that maybe the reason you haven't seen spirits is because your disbelief is actually a benefit. Yeah. And so he's like, maybe you didn't experience anything because you are a skeptic, but he's like, in this case, it's going to have the exact opposite effect, that it's somehow going to trigger this room to even prey on him. And he kind of describes it as a room of poison gas.
Yes.
And he's like, if you go in briefly and you hold your breath, you can make it out okay. And he's like, that's how I've been able to go into that room as much as I have. Or they call them C and V, the sisters. Yeah, like how they were able to kind of do it because it's just in and out. But he's like, if you stay the whole night, once again, no one's ever made it past like, what is it, an hour or something? Or I can't remember. Or is that more the movie? Now I'm trying to remember.
He mentions about an hour in the book,
Okay.
but the movie makes it much more of a strict timer-based thing. We're going to get to another part of the story now that probably scares me almost more than anything. Because at this point, Mike has said, thanks, but no thanks. I'm going up. Olin escorts him up the elevator.
He's got an old-timey key because electronics don't work.
Yeah, mag cards do not work. So Mike leaves the elevator after, again, last plea. Please, for the love of God, don't elevator door closes. Goodbye. So Mike starts his walk down the hall. And I love where it says that his problems with the room began before he even entered it. Because he's standing in front of the door. This freaks me out every time. The door is crooked. It's canted just slightly to the left, but just in a way he describes it as like how you would see in a movie, like if they're trying to show someone is sort of like mentally unstable or something like that. And then he looks away and then it's straight again.
It's not crooked.
I would lose my mind just from that little moment alone. Those tiny little details.
It's such a subtle thing, but it's really unsettling. It reminds me a lot of, I reference this a lot because it's so well done, in The Ring.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There's nothing outwardly creepy about the movie. It just makes you feel off. It's an unsettling set of images. And what I love about this story is it's not boogity boogity boo. It's very much things just being off or odd or weird. And it kind of builds this growing paranoia and sense that things are not right, and it kind of sucks you in. And we're going to get to more of it. This is so good.
Yeah. And so what proceeds to happen, because Mike actually spends about 70 minutes in the room and he has a little handheld tape recorder. And this is a narrative device that was so inventive.
Oh, this is great.
I absolutely love the way King portrays
this.
And
I forgot about this too.
Right. This is so good. So as Mike hits record on his little handheld recorder and he's narrating into it, we have Mike's dialogue, but then King sort of, the narration jumps forward and says, but what was actually played on the tape is just him saying one or two things.
It's basically like, of the 11 minutes that was captured when his tape recorder was recovered, is very unsettling. And it builds this whole thing before you even hear the things he says, where it's like, people don't want to listen to it. They can't get the whole way through. They want to stop. And it's just this very odd set of things that he says. And so it kind of breaks away and then comes back very seamlessly.
Mike has a little cigarette tucked behind his ear as sort of a little superstition thing. He used to smoke, and then his brother, also a smoker, died of lung cancer. So Mike keeps that cigarette there as sort of like, he called it like a break glass in case of emergency.
Right. And he has his Hawaiian shirt. That's his other good luck charm.
Yeah, his lucky shirt. That's right. But in one part of one of the things he says into the tape recorder that makes no sense, he was like, my brother died. Actually, my brother was eaten by wolves on the Connecticut Turnpike.
Yeah.
Like, I just got goosebumps actually saying those words because it's so randomly dark and messed up. And then he says, why would I say it? Like to himself, why would I say that? And then he records himself. It was later recorded him saying, I need to get a hold of myself. Right. Although he has no indication that he knows that he's saying these things, right?
Yeah, you simultaneously get this experience of what was recorded and what he is experiencing.
He's in this completely dissociative state where what he's seeing and what he's relaying are two totally different things. It's like his brain and his body are on two different tracks. And the way King captures this and the narration is so good. And that's even before we start getting to the actual room, like the elements of the room itself. I love that he compares it to being stoned on bad dope. He starts to have these visual hallucinations. And at first and in the movie, this is made a little more apparent, but I think in the book, he's also like, maybe I have been drugged or maybe this is all Olin's doing, you know, he put this suggestion in my head.
He has a sense that the CCTV, they're just laughing at him in the hallway. Like, they're playing a little trick on him and they're just having a laugh at his expense. You get that paranoia in both. It's a little more overstated in the movie, but yeah, you definitely get it here too.
For instance, he gets into the room and he's going through, and it's a pretty basic room, but it's very like the colors are a little garish. You know, he talks about like there's this still life of fruit painting on the wall, and how the way he's talking about it, it's again some of those like weird phrases that he uses, and like definitely like looks like it's like fruit rotting in the sun. That's what it looks like, because the color orange features very heavily in this, almost like a visual motif. And there's a breakfast menu on the nightstand next to the bed. And every time he looks at it, looks away, looks back, the languages change. Yeah. First it's French, then it's Russian, then it's Italian.
And then it's gone.
And then it's gone. Yeah. And then it's replaced with a woodcut of a wolf eating a screaming boy's leg.
Jeez.
And he talks about like the sort of halty, jerky like motion of it, almost like you're looking at like a flip book animation. Oh God. Okay. So, and then the patterns on the wallpaper also shift and warp, and the paintings start to change. There's a woman, and this kind of pops up a little later because it wasn't there before, but it was like there's a picture of still life of a woman that grows increasingly grotesque the more he looks at it, where she's like topless all of a sudden and she's got blood coming out of her nipples. I mean, there's all these things. And then later on, again, that herky-jerky animation, she gets up and like runs away into the painting.
But she has like cannibal teeth too?
Eats cannibal teeth. Ugh. Yes. Her teeth are filed into points. That's right.
He has a lot of tactile imagery as well. He says the dust feels greasy and slippery like silk just before it rots.
And then he's like, what does that even mean? I don't even know what that feels like. Because he doesn't want to touch the bed.
Yes.
Yeah, the bed is like terrifying
He's
to
like,
him,
I'm not
and you can only imagine. And he doesn't want to touch the wall.
He fumbles for the light, and he says that the wallpaper felt like old dead skin. Ugh.
Yeah.
And then as he's walking around, he said, "This is the best word. His shoes are making a smooching sound, like they're sticking." And there's something about smooching sound. You automatically know what that means. Even though it kind of doesn't make sense, you're like, nope, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Anybody who saw Nightmare on Elm Street when they're going up the stairs. Yeah. The immediate thought that I had.
It's not quite as pronounced, but you get a sense that almost like the floor is trying to suck him in. And it's just, the tactile and the description and the imagery. Again, nothing here is boogity demons and monsters. It's just off. Yeah.
So off, and then increasingly threatening, because then the phone rings and this voice comes through, and what it says, it seems very nonsensical at first, because like the voice itself doesn't sound human. I love the way he described it as a pair of hair clippers that have learned to talk.
Geez. So good.
And the dialogue, like, this is 9. We have killed your friends. Every friend is now dead. This is 6. And he's like going through these, and apparently it's referring to like the number of people
who died
that were killed. And, but every friend is now dead. Again, that's kind of a Dark Tower reference. In fact, this whole room could be theorized to be part of the Tower multiverse.
Interesting.
Yeah. I also love the way he describes the way the room starts to melt around him and taking on these bowing. He called them Moorish bows. So if you think of like architecture that has like a lot of curvature, like a old cathedral or something like that.
The floor kind of goes concave, and he says the walls bulge like there's mouths behind it. Oh. So creepy.
Again, it's like a really bad fever dream is what this is turning into.
And everything being bathed in yellow orange glow, which in his mind, he's like, it's like tango light. The kind of light that makes the dead crawl from their graves and dance. Again, nonsense. Did you get a little bit of a Deadlights vibe from this?
Oh, very much.
So if you're not familiar with it and the entity behind the clown, there's this idea of these orange dancing deadlights, and that's what draws you in. And, you know, you mentioned the connection to the Dark Tower and the metaverse.
Yes, that's right.
Which I think tangentially, or at least in some part, the It creature is a part of. And this felt very much in that vein. It was almost tantalizing and drew him in, and eventually causes him to do what?
in pure desperation, because when he first gets into the room, he notices a book of matches in the ashtray, and he pockets it. And he manages to pull the matches out and notices the, closed cover before striking, because it's a really old school book of matches. And he lights the entire book of matches and sets his shirt on fire. And it's this old polyester shirt, right? Well, at this point, he starts burning himself, and the room starts to lose interest in him, because he tried to open the door before and it was locked. So he couldn't get out. And even though the door was unlocked, it just wasn't opening. But once he was on fire, it was like the room's way of saying, "Ew, I don't like cooked meat." I think that was the phrase used. And so he stumbles out into the hall, and there's another hotel guest who's coming back from the ice machine. And he sees a man on fire, and then he just dumps his ice on him, and the doors open. And I love this. The guest from the hotel looks very tantalized by that light coming from inside, because by this point it's a blazing orange sun, and he compares it to a trip he took to Ayers Rock in Australia, the Australian outback.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he also said the wall began to open up to another world where something terrible approaches. So again, you have this almost like merging of worlds, this place where two worlds are kind of at a meeting point.
And it's almost like, again, cosmic horror.
Very much
this
so.
is very, very Lovecraft. And so Mike says, "Don't go in there, the room's haunted." And the second he says those words, the door slams shut. And so basically the story is mostly over at this point. You have a brief denouement where Insulin talks about his writing career is pretty much over. He can't write anymore. He said every time he tries to write, he gets that orange light or something, because he can't remember everything that happened.
He can't remember what happens in the room, but he's still plagued with nightmares. And he says that he can't stand to watch the sunset. So he moves to the coast, I think in Jersey coast, or no, Long Island. Sorry, he moves to Long Island. And he can't stand to watch the sunset because of that yellow-orange light. So he has the recording that he can listen to, but and his publisher won't even listen to it.
He keeps the recorder in his safe.
That's right.
He tried to convince Mike to write about his experiences in the room, but it's just never going to happen. And even the publisher says that he can't even bring himself to play it for people that would love to hear it, because it's so bad. And also, I love it. It says that Mike sleeps with his lights on, and he's removed all the phones from his house.
And he has health ailments. He has physical health ailments,
high blood pressure, and all kinds of stuff. And so it just does not end on a great note. Like, he got out, but he was unscathed, or wasn't unscathed. And the sad part is he doesn't quite, it's almost a blessing that he doesn't remember, but we have this very traumatized person going through the world, and that room is still there. I mean, it's so lesson learned.
And there's just a great end point, which it kind of comes back to what was said earlier, where he's like, it was never human. At least ghosts were once human. So it really brings back to, we don't know exactly what this cosmic horror was, but it ain't right and it ain't human.
Yeah. And, so real quick, because it was made into a movie, and a fantastic movie, by the way. I think this is one of the better adaptations of a King story. It was released in 2007, and it was directed by Swedish filmmaker Michael Hofstrom. I've probably pronounced that incorrectly. So John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson, who also appeared in another Stephen King adaptation, which is Cell, in 2016.
And Cusack was in Stand By Me.
Yes, exactly. And this movie was very financially successful. It did really well. And I love it because it adapts the story in a very faithful kind of way, but it also expands on it in ways that show that they really wanted to bring in a lot of King's elements. It really understood what King was trying to do. And then it added some really fun little Easter eggs at the same time. And one thing that I really, really love that it did, for instance, is that in the movie, John Cusack says into his recorder, the hotel rooms are just naturally creepy places, don't you think? I mean, how many people have slept in that bed before you? How many of them were sick? How many of them were losing their minds? And that was something Stephen King actually wrote in the story notes for this book in Everything's Eventual. You can actually read that.
So I have to tell you, I watched that movie, and then as I was reading I read the short story, I reread it last. And as I was reading his note, I was like, wait a minute, I'm pretty sure John Cusack's character says that in the movie. And lo and behold, it was. And I was like, oh, that's great. What a nice little nugget.
And in the movie too, like the director, they put so much thought into the tiny little things. So the DVD runtime is exactly 104 minutes and 8 seconds. And also used other things for the number 13, which we already know 1408 adds to 13. The room's key lock has 6214 etched into it, which adds up to 13. Those digits do. The first death was in 1912, which also adds to 13. Also, if you add 19 and 12, you get 31, which is 13 in reverse. And then even the month and year of the movie's release date, June 2007, sums up to 13 because of 6 and 7.
So good.
Which is just funny. I mean, it's just these little things they try to do to make it fit. Also, Olin offers Mike in the movie. And I love Samuel L. Jackson in this role, by the way. They both did such a good job. They were having a great time making this. You can tell. He offers Mike a bottle of brandy, and it's called, oh God, I can't even.
We don't know French,
I'm not
everybody.
Going to try to pronounce it.
Do you want me to? Les 57 de 16.
Okay, yes. Thank you. He did so much better than I would have. And it literally means the 57 deaths. And just afterwards, we learned that in room 1408, there were only 56 deaths, but it's assumed that Mike was going to be included.
Which is a good Easter egg that if you don't know French or you didn't pay attention to the bottle, you wouldn't pick up on.
I was studying that bottle so hard just to see what it was, because I was like, okay, I saw it was cognac. And then I was like, all right, I know what it is, but I didn't notice anything beyond that. So then another thing that I learned, this is so cool, is toward the end of the film, there's a fireman that breaks down the hotel door at the end, and it's the same axe that Jack Nicholson used in The Shining.
So good.
It's like, you could tell this has the same touches that a Mike Flanagan or Rob Reiner adaptation has of Stephen King's work, where you have a true fan, or Frank Darabont, where they not are just adapting this one story. They're adapting King into this movie.
It adds another great little element to it as well, where obviously you get more backstory, you get more character development.
Yeah.
You learn about Mike's estranged wife, his daughter who has died under circumstances we don't quite understand. You get a little bit of his dad, you can tell was probably in a hospital or a hospice kind of dying, and there was a relationship there. And there's a part early in the movie where he goes out surfing and he kind of misses a wave and it tossles him around and he washes up ashore and he's choking on water and someone comes up to help him. And it's just kind of a throwaway thing you don't think too much about. Well, at the end of the movie, as the room is kind of collapsing in on him, there's a bunch of this water that comes in because there's a painting of a ship. And all of a sudden the room is just getting blasted with water. And you cut to a scene of him washing up on shore. And it gives you that moment where you're like, wait, did he just dream all of this as he's being tumbled around in the undertow of the water? And it goes back to his normal life and things are fine, but he starts eventually to recognize people in the real world that were people who work at the hotel, and suddenly we're sucked back in and he never really left. And it's just it's a great movie device that I think they did a good job with.
They did. They had me convinced that he actually got out, that they were just flashing back. They were flashing forward. Like, okay, he got out of the room and this is him dealing with the aftermath and all this. And then, yes, you never escaped. When that world starts to bleed back through, it's so beautifully done. And of course, the things that they added about his daughter introduces this theme of grief, which is, I think, appropriate for this story because a lot of people died in this room. So it's really, he's in this place of deep tragedy and he has his own tragedy that the room is trying to exploit. And I saw a reference saying that throughout his course of time in that room, which again was being timed by the bed's alarm clock, and it was playing The Carpenters' We've Only Just Begun, which I never thought that song would be scary, but
especially when it's kind of bored, when it's like, it's only just begun. Like, it's just like out of key and everything, but it so much reminded me of like a very sinister Groundhog's Day where he keeps I got you babe from Sonny and Cher. It's almost like this, because it happens a couple times where he's just sitting there and the alarm clock blasts. And then eventually it has this like, it stops showing the time and it's a countdown from 60 minutes.
Oh God, it's yeah, such a great device. And the room itself is very different in terms of what it does to him, and it does play with like reality. One of the creepier moments in the movie is he's trying to yell across the street to someone in the office, and then suddenly you realize it's just him.
It's a reflection of him.
It's a reflection of him, but it's like a darker version of him.
But then somebody with a knife comes up behind the reflection and he turns around and there's someone coming at him. Oh, that is like the most like freak out, jump out of your seat moment. It's so good.
It's so good. And it really plays so well as a one-man show. I mean, Cusack is throwing his whole self into this. And I brought up the grief thing because they show that Cusack is actually going through all the stages of grief throughout his time in this room. And so it's a brilliant kind of acting out of his personal tragedy and processing that. And then everything that the room is trying to throw at him. And so it really becomes a man versus the room kind of situation.
And he gets great lines that he says into the recorder. There's one where he comes back into the bathroom and the toilet paper has been refolded in that little like V shape that they do. And he's like, finally, something for me to write about, a ghost that offers turn down service. So he's just being really salty. And then he's like, he's still being very skeptical and like, okay, we can logic this way. So he's like, let's Encyclopedia Brown this bitch. And so he's starting to like logic through and he thinks there's somebody up in the vent in the ceiling. That kind of keeps being this like callback where he thinks they're watching through there. Yeah. And to your earlier point about the story, at one point he's like, wait, he gave me booze. Did Olin take a sip? I can't remember. And then he looks at the bed and he's like, or maybe it's the chocolate. Don't take candy from strangers. He just has these little funny, quippy things that he says that I think the movie caught a lot better than the short story. And of course, John Cusack delivers it like flawlessly. It's so good.
I mean, he was so perfectly cast for it because in so many movies that he's in, he has that kind of dry charm. Yeah. Like a movie like Gross Point Blank, for instance, is a movie where he's fully John Cusack in that. And so it's almost like he brought that plus with the emotional weight of everything else that he's going through. I love too when the thermostat, the room's really hot, and he literally says to the maintenance, like, the room's on fire.
Yeah.
Like, when the thermostat's busted and he can't, so, exactly. So there's a lot of beautiful, subtle things in this that really reward multiple watchings. I hadn't actually watched this movie since I saw it in the theater when it came out. So it was really great to revisit this one. And especially after experiencing the short story a lot and just seeing again the beauty of what a film adaptation can achieve whenever the person doing the adaptation is so thoughtful and considers the author and in it, which I think is the key to making it work. I think Frank Darabont brought that up as well in his adaptation of Shawshank. Is he really, everything that he added was done considering King's own voice, because get busy living or get busy dying, that's a Frank Darabont line, but that sounds exactly like something Stephen King would write. And you get a lot of that in this as well.
Before we get to the ending, I do have a line I want to mention, which is when he gets pulled back into the room after the fake out, the clock returns to 60 minutes again. Again, kind of Groundhog's Day. He's going to have to relive it. So this hotel operator calls and Mike's like, why haven't I been killed yet? And she's like, our guests enjoy free will. You can relive the past hour over and over again or use our express checkout system, which is a noose.
Which is
again, a whole invention of this story, but it's just this great little device where it takes this idea of a hotel express checkout, but in this case, you hang yourself or you can keep living this nightmare. And much like in the short story Trucks, he improvises a Molotov cocktail and burns the room down and eventually is able to escape that way. And I think we're going to get to the ending that confused the crap out of you.
Yeah, so when I saw this in the theater, the ending that I got is the one Chris pretty much explained. It's the default ending.
The theatrical release.
So you'll also find this used on Amazon Prime, Netflix UK, and the YouTube movies version. And that's where Mike survives. He, sets the room and himself on fire. He gets out and he and his ex-wife reconcile, and she is skeptical of his experience. And eventually they pull out the tape recorder and find on the mini cassette, a voice of their daughter, to kind of like, and that kind of ends on that note of like, oh my God, this really happened. It was kind of a beautiful ending. I prefer it. The ending that I saw when I watched this the other night, because I just have a version of it that is on my home theater PC. And I didn't realize this at the time that there are multiple endings of this movie. So I was waiting for that moment of Mike getting out. Well, no, he dies in the fire. And Olin shows up at the funeral with a box containing Mike's remaining possessions, like the tape recorder and things like that, and tries to give it to Lily, the wife. And she's like, no, I don't want it. And Olin goes back to his car and sees a very burnt Mike in the back seat. And then Olin's just like, okay, so basically he's haunting him. It kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. In a way, I kind of wish this ending wasn't there.
It seemed very convoluted.
And then it cuts back to the burnt down hotel room with Mike in it. And then he hears his daughter's voice and he goes off to be with her. Like he's living in the afterlife, but he's in the hotel room. But he's not.
Yeah.
And the room is destroyed, but it's not, because Olin tells the wife, well, the room's destroyed. It'll never hurt anyone again. But here's Mike in the room as a ghost, smoking a cigarette.
I haven't seen this ending, but it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. And this is the ending that plays in Canada on various networks. It's also used on FX whenever they show it down here on FX. And it's also used in the UK and Australian DVDs and the US iTunes and Netflix versions of the film.
So
I don't
weird.
know why the endings are so randomly distributed this way. I know just from my own little insights on how sometimes rights are distributed and licenses are purchased that, different markets get different endings. We had this with like The Descent has 2 different endings. Paranormal Activity has multiple endings. Depending on what market you're in, you're going to see a different one. But then there's the original ending, which they tested this with the studio and they didn't like it. And so it was changed. But Mike dies in the fire. And instead of the funeral scene from the director's cut, the sounds of a funeral are dubbed over shots of Los Angeles. Lily and Sam, that's the publisher, sort through Mike's effects. Sam returns to his New York office and discovers the manuscript Mike wrote while he was in the room, which is interesting because we don't see him writing a manuscript at all. He doesn't have time for that.
He's not in there that long. It's so weird. Yeah.
And yeah, as Sam reads the story, audio from Mike's experiences in the room is heard. In a final scene, Sam's office door slams shut and Mike's father, which is again kind of weird, pops up and says, as I was, you are, as I am, you will be. So what this ending assumes is there are probably a lot of multiple scenes that were cut that show maybe Mike writing a book in this room and more from Mike's father. Because we don't get a ton. We get the sense that Mike and his father had a strained and difficult relationship.
We do get that quote when he's in the room and he has a vision of his father. We do get that same quote, but why would he be coming after Sam? Like these 2 alternate endings don't make any sense.
No, they don't. And I feel kind of sad for the alternate markets that are. This original ending isn't anywhere from what I understand, which is good. But the ending that is in multiple, like Australia, UK, I'm kind of sad that that's the ending because I feel like the theatrical ending is the best one. I feel like it's maybe not as ambiguous as a typical Stephen King ending. In fact, it has a lot more resolution that way, but I feel like it fits the story and these characters better. And it gives Mike a reward for everything that he went through in the sense of, he's reconciling with his wife and he can get some closure and kind of deal with the grief.
For me, it's just a logical conclusion. And like,
right. And and it makes sense.
like back when we talked about The Mist, what I didn't like about the movie ending is it was just too ham-fisted. Like it wasn't necessarily the ending itself, it was how it was executed. And this one is just like, it just feels like a sloppy Joe ending. And it's not for the movie we got. You're right. Maybe there's an extended cut where it makes more sense, but clearly the version you watched did not add enough back in for this ending to really logically make sense. Whereas again, the theatrical release ending does have an internal logic to it. And so that's, I think, why I like it. If they left a more ambiguous ending that stayed true to the room and how it operates, I'd be all for that. There's a great ambiguous ending at the end of The Descent in the more like the UK non-US version. It's fantastic, but it makes sense. And in this case, this just doesn't.
Yeah, this definitely feels like a deleted scene that should have been left deleted instead. So yeah, two really fantastic stories from this collection, and make it worth buying this collection alone. But I tell you, there are so many fantastic stories in this. And so these were our two favorites. I mean, we said it was a mini episode, but hey, this is mini for us.
I told you it'd be a full episode, Allison. There's too much good stuff to talk about.
There really is. And so we hope you all go out and check this one out. And
what's that?
When you add up all the episodes, including the bonus ones, it equals 13.
What? Wah, wah, wah.
That was rather not intentional. I never expected that I would have an episode on the stand. So that was a little surprise on my end that I had someone come through that wanted to record with me on that. So that's how we kind of got there. And thank you to David Kazi for joining me on that one, because that was a blast.
You need to edit this episode down to 1 hour, 4 minutes, 8 seconds.
I'm going to make that a goal, Chris.
108.4. You can play a little bit. Give us a couple extra minutes.
I agree. We'll get 13 either way. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to wrap this up here. And as always, thank you for joining us. And head on over to 80s High and check out Chris. Review us both on iTunes. We need some love. We need some exposure.
If you please.
Yeah, we would really, really love that. Feel free to reach out to me at Gmail, DDDarknessTime, or on Twitter. Same handle, DDDarknessTime, Instagram, samesies. All right, guys. Well, talk to you later. Have a good night. Sleep well in your haunted orange rotten fruit room.
As I was, you are. As I am, you will be.
I live in the weak and the wounded. Okay, that's different title, but we
still chills.
Ding Dong Darkness Time has been brought to you and produced by yours truly, Allison Dixon. It was made possible by an array of amazing co-hosts, friends, family, but especially you, the listeners. Big shouts also go out to the brilliant Nathaniel Dixon for the show art and future legend Spencer Morlock for all the music. I'll be back again soon with another episode. In the meantime, be good, you little ding-dongs.